Since the earliest cavemen looked up at the sky, people have been seduced by space. Even today, its awesome majesty and sheer beauty continue to attract followers. Only now they've traded their caves for sheds. Inside these makeshift structures is the world of the amateur astronomer. Behind these doors are a band of people separated by age, background and skill, yet united by one thing, their love of the heavens.
When I was 11, I joined the British Astronomical Association, and so I thought one day I'm going to have a big telescope and contribute. And about 4 years later, when I was 15, I actually built my own telescope and started making observations.
You can see all these galaxies, planets in books, but I still rather look through a telescope and see the actual thing, see the light from this object going directly after perhaps travelling for millions of miles through space, coming directly, going right into my eye.
Sun's still shining.
There is an aesthetic side to astronomy. I mean, the very beauty of the night sky. To go out and look at lunar observations, for example, the moon is a very beautiful place when you look at it. So I think about that. I think about the footprints of the astronauts that are still there.
I'm really not quite certain what the fundamental drive is. It's just that it's quite important to know, quite important to be certain, quite important to see that there is a big universe out there.
But is there more to amateur astronomy than simply stargazing? How important are these unpaid part-timers in unravelling the secrets of the universe? Astronomy has never failed to pull the crowds. In fact, some events happen so rarely, like the transit of Venus between the Earth and the Sun, that if you miss it, you're unlikely to see it again in your lifetime. For most of us, this is as close to astronomy as we get. But for a small group of enthusiasts, it's only the tip of the iceberg.
An amateur astronomer is somebody who loves astronomy. I mean, the word amateur means amour, it means to love. And they are passionate about astronomy. They live in this sort of twilight world. They have their own day jobs, but what they're living for is to look at the stars at night.
There are more than 40,000 amateur astronomers in Britain today, looking at everything from planets to variable stars and supernovae. Some observe for fun, while for others it's a full-time hobby. But what unites them in this twilight world is a common interest which can be traced back to their childhood.
In 1957, Brook Bond-T produced 50 outer space cards. And I was 9 years old at the time, and I spotted them and I fell in love. Those 50 cards, oh God, my family must have drunk tea till we were kind of orange. Because you could never, it was always the same when you collected cards, you could never get all of them, you know, you always ended up with 15 Venuses and no Jupiter or something like that. But we drank away and bought lots of tea, and I filled up a little album that you could get free if you sent off for it. But they were very informative, and even if I close my eyes now, I can picture the exact shade of Jupiter on one of the cards. I think it was number 9 with all the planets on it. Jupiter was purple, as I recall. And I was just astonished that all this stuff was known about and written down, and that began a lifelong interest.
The 1957 Brook Bond-T cards signalled a revival of interest in astronomy that had waned during the 2 world wars. Several national and international events also swelled this tide of enthusiasm by bringing space into people's homes.
This first satellite was today successfully launched in the USSR.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth.
Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
The launch of Sputnik in 1957 heralded the start of the space race, which turned the sky into a new political playground for the Russians and Americans. It also turned everyone's eyes heavenwards for the first time since the war.
There's no doubt there was a space race. The Russians and the Americans were trying to beat each other, and the space race did boost space research along, and therefore astronomy well. And that's where, in a way, I come into the story.
The start of Patrick Moore's landmark TV series The Sky at Night in 1957 coincided with this new fascination with space. So popular was it that it turned him into a household name and opened up the world of astronomy to a wider public.
Good evening. Well, this is the 50th Sky at Night. We began the series way back in April 1957, and look how much has happened since then. In those days, space research was still at a very early stage. Well, since we've had the Sputniks, we've had the American Earth satellites, we've had the planetary probes, and of course we've had the first men in space. But as well as that, we've had a lot happening too on the purely astronomical field. We've had several bright comets, and we've had a close approach of Mars, and of course we've had the total eclipse of the sun last February, which we were able to televise direct.
We didn't have a television until I was about 10, but yes, then I started watching Patrick Moore's Sky at Night, and already he gave the impression of having been around describing the universe since the Big Bang. To me and to hundreds of thousands of others, you know, he was the voice of the universe.
There is definitely a lightning over there now, George. Can you see it? It's coming out. Yes, there is the moon. I can see it for the moment. No, it's gone again.
It's gone. However,
absolutely infuriating, and there's nothing one can do.
People don't watch The Sky at Night for the astronomy, they watch it for Patrick, for goodness sake. He is the quintessential amateur astronomer. He loves astronomy. He's got his telescopes in his garden and all that kind of thing. He loves telescopes and cats. And he's been, you know, he's so influential.
One thing we want to try and do is to make a complex subject look simple. Well, I try and do that. Others do it better than I can, but I try and do that. Also in The Sky at Night, we mix things up. Some programs are far more abstruse than others. And after all, you know, astronomy now is such a vast subject, no one can cover it all. And your astronomer who's researching on distant galaxies may not know much about the atmosphere of Mars. Therefore, we're watched by people of all kinds, I think, professional and amateurs, and all ages, from 6 to 90.
Armed with Patrick's know-how, the public's interest in astronomy grew rapidly through the 60s as astronauts broke through new frontiers in space.
I think for anyone who wasn't older than about, say, 7 or 8 in 1969, they've really missed what an incredible era that was, because you went in the state of a few days from landing a man on the moon being total science fiction to it being science fact.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
When Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the moon, it was one of the defining moments of the decade.
You're going too fast on the panorama sweep. You're going to have to
And
stop.
British audiences were treated to a first-hand account when Patrick Moore interviewed Armstrong on his return to Earth.
Mr. Armstrong, you're one of the very, very few people, I think, whose opinion on this is really worth having. In fact, there are only 4 of you. I do realize that when you were on the moon, you had very little time for gazing upwards. But could you tell us something about what the sky actually looks like from the moon, the sun, the earth, the stars, if any, and so on?
the sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. The Earth is the only visible object other than the sun that can be seen, although there have been some reports of seeing planets. I myself did not see planets from the surface, but I suspect they might be visible. The Earth is quite beautiful from space and from the moon. It looks quite small and quite remote, but it's very blue and covered with white lace of the clouds, and the continents are clearly seen, although they have very little color from that distance.
Interviews like this proved so popular that Patrick Moore succeeded in wooing a new, young audience of would-be astronomers.
I was always interested in rockets and space, even as far back as I can remember, probably to about 5 or 6. But it was when I was 10 in 1968 that I picked up a friend's copy of The Observer's Book of Astronomy by Patrick Moore. And for the first time I saw pictures in that book that were actually of telescopes that were bigger than high street telescopes, but not as big as professional telescopes on mountains. I suddenly realised that there were people in their back gardens doing real astronomy that was of use. And so from that moment on, I think I was pretty much hooked.
You know, I'm asked many times every week how one starts taking up astronomy as a hobby, and I always give the same answer. You don't, in fact, need any optical equipment whatsoever, and you certainly don't need a large and expensive telescope. And my advice is that if you want to start taking a real interest in astronomy, the very first step is to buy a star map, which only costs a shilling or two, and then go out and learn your way around the sky. Of course, one thing one's got to bear in mind straight away is the question of cost. If one's only got a very limited amount of money to spend on equipment, and this certainly applies to most of us, then there's a straightforward choice between a very small telescope or a pair of binoculars.
As it happens, one amateur at the time was already showing you didn't even need a pair of binoculars to make a discovery.
It was in this homemade observatory in his back garden that Graham Hosty was keeping a routine check on the stars, as he's done almost nightly for the last 10 years, using the most primitive of astronomical equipment, half an old pair of binoculars, when he spotted something new. Within seconds, he realized it was a hitherto undiscovered nova star, and was just able to record his findings before it disappeared behind the nearby rooftops.
The amateur's tireless commitment to patrolling the skies in all weathers was one of the driving forces behind this tradition. The national passion for making things was another.
The English tradition is deeply pragmatic. It's the product of people who not only wanted to know the structure of the universe, where it came from, how it was made, but had a fascination with the nuts and bolts of instruments. How do I make a bigger telescope? A more stable telescope. It's not a speculative tradition. It's not a tradition which is driven by woolly thinking. It's very, very much of a hands-on tradition.
My grandfather used to work at Land's End Radio, and being out there on night duty, he got bored looking out at nothing across the sea, so he made a telescope. And my father made telescopes from all the bits, and I used to make telescopes, and then he led on from there. And in fact, some of the bits of the telescope are actually there now on this bench. Those are some of the bits that were made, that part of his telescopes that were made 60, 70, 80 years ago, not that. This bit, 60, 70, 80 years, are just scraps. I don't know what happened to the main telescopes, they've all gone.
I suppose after World War II, it became possible very, very suddenly to make quite good instruments cheap. Because, of course, things like lenses used in periscopes in submarines suddenly had no purpose. You could buy them for about £5. These were absolutely top-quality lenses. And the equipment used by what they call WD, War Department reject material, suddenly made it possible for all kinds of people to put decent-ish instruments together.